Hi, and welcome back to Plan 9 Crunch. I'm Joe Gibson, and I like to talk about Gamera on this channel. As the primary box office rival to Godzilla in that early run of films, he's an important cult figure. And the team that made him the way he was, Noriaki Yuasa, Nisan Takahashi, Akira Inoue, Masaichi, and Hidemasa Nagata, etc., also made other monsters to fight him, obviously. So I was thinking, why not rank all of the Gamera series Kaiju? As complete as I can. I recently released a blog post, link will be in the description, talking about who I think the big five kaiju would be in the Gamera franchise, and as that was less about my subjective opinions of favorites than it was about which monsters have slouched into series-defining roles, this ranking is an interesting companion piece to that essay. I do need to give a couple disclaimers though before we begin. I intend this to actually be a pretty complete ranking, meaning incorporating some of the kaiju from the supplementary comics and books. The only problem is those are really hard to find in Japanese and much harder to find in English. This ranking is subjective, and especially the parts discussing these minor kaiju in manga I have not read will focus on the designs. I've seen some scans from some of the things. I'm not going in this blind, but I haven't had the physical book in my hand, so whatever qualia you want to talk about in terms of understanding these monsters, some of which I can't at all, others I can't fully grasp, if that makes sense. Unless I miscounted, I have 30 kaiju here to talk about, so let us begin with the first 15 as sort of honorable mentions. So, this first grouping, 28, 29, and 30. Veora, Sora, and Bodera are the names of three monsters from the prequel comic to Gamera Rebirth called Code Thyrsus. Veora is the bat thing on your left, Sora is the whale god inspired thing in the middle, and Bodera is whatever Bodera is. I cannot weigh in on the comic yet, as it will not arrive until late November. But the designs are cool. If these appear in later Gamer projects, or have impressive characterization in the comic, they could rise in my rankings, but as is, the issue here is that though Veora and Sora are cool, I would rather have Gyaos and the Whale God. They're seeming inspirations. Bodera is unique though, and would make for a fun future opponent. Alright, so 27. The Whale God. So I just mentioned that Sora is an admittedly cooler, with a beam effect, ripoff of the Whale God. 1962 film from Daiei, so it would make just as much sense appearing in a film alongside Gamera as it did for Rodan to co-star with Godzilla. This is a movie I should seek out before I say anything more, but from what I understand, the movie works based on how the Whale God represents something to the leads, not how he is as a kaiju. He's not really a kaiju. Just a pretty big whale that they want to kill. That's the tentative reason for this placement. But like I said, Rodan, though also a kaiju, was more of a tragedy than it was an action movie, so transplanting that into monster fights with Godzilla, you could do the same thing here. Okay. 26. Phoenix. Information on Nisan Takahashi's Gamera vs. Phoenix book is both sparse and contradictory. It may be a Yuasa-directed hour-long special converted into a book, or Takahashi pitched it to Ishiro Honda, the Godzilla director, to direct. I don't see how both can be true. It may also be about a suicidal pollution firebird impervious to all of Gamera's attacks as part of a pretty on-the-nose environmentalism story. But I have just the one source for that, and it isn't Wikizilla, who otherwise I respect as the best source for kaiju. Anyway, if that all is true, this would go up a few spots. But until I get a better reason to believe that, I cannot put the bird any higher. It is just a red firebird based on design. It's not outdoing any versions of Gyaos, especially how in the culture, the vermilion bird archetype can also be done by Gyaos, and often is, so just doing that. Anyway. Number 25, Futakoburappa. Futakoburappa. He gains points for the most absurd name, but is actually rather derivative of a previous monster in name and design. Actually, its supporting cast, the next few monsters, comes from a 1994 to 95 manga run. I have tried to find ways to buy, but I haven't been able to. I've looked at scans of their pages, though. I have least information on this monster of those ones. Just the look of this absurd chicken monster with a split skull. Hari Nezura, number 24, is a mole kaiju named after the word for hedgehog, but also Daiei's scrapped rat monster Nezura, and physically references a previous design for a previous draft of Virus, who we'll get to a lot later. This kaiju does not have an identity on its own, that I can tell. It is a cool design. That's why it's above Futako Bukurapa, whatever. Doblius. Doblius is a more interesting kaiju just for the multiple heads, which you might not even notice because it looks more like hair, but it is a bargain bin version of a different scrap monster we'll get to later, just with arms now. Still, pretty cool design. I would like to see Gamera fight a two-headed monster. Coming at it from both sides, it'd be cool. I should have explained that. Okay, 22. I was not going to include the Pyron Seijin because they are from a 1956 Daiei movie, Warning from Space, that predates Gamera, and they are Seijin. That is to say, alien invaders, not kaiju. Here's the thing, though. Virus, who, again, is strangely the connecting factor for a lot of these, is also a race of aliens. Like Pyron, the Virians are smaller. They're based on sea creatures in design and can disguise themselves as humans. The only difference here is benevolence. That is interesting. Don't get me wrong, I would much rather see the Virians come back than these guys, but they could have their place in the Gamera series as the good counterpart to the Virians. They've been referenced in other stuff that I found out about them was in this research. Okay. Maruga Rappa has a very similar name to the demented chicken thing, but it is not the inspiration for it either. This is from the same manga run, and is in fact the Pigmon of this series, a human-sized benevolent monster that I can only hope and pray dies brutally every time it goes up against another monster, like Pigmon. I find the concept entertaining. It is possible the execution is far worse than I could anticipate, but let's be optimistic and say that he's not just annoying. In terms of similarities to Futa Ellipsis, the beak, body, the demented eyes, but it's not quite as similar to their inspiration, the first of the overly long Rappa named things. Number 20, Garen Sharp is not Gara Sharp. Okay, that might be confusing. A snake with more or less this exact design exists as a major multimedia character in the Gamera IP, called Gara Sharp. I guess the makers of this same comic run did not think they could use Gara Sharp, or thought for whatever reason Gara Sharp didn't work, but an exact copy would land. It is what it is. I'm confused why it exists. As I will touch on later, I think Gara Sharp is a really cool monster and design, so Gara Sharp Light is here only because of how cool its inspiration is. You could argue this is cooler than the 1991 original Gara Sharp design, but there's also the 1995 concept as well as the Last Hope to reckon with, so no, Gara Sharp is here, Gara Sharp will be later. Gebarus gets this spot only because, as the first plant monster, one could see it as inspiring the Legion plant. Sorry, first plant monster in the Gamera IP. The Mammoth Flower from Ultra Q predates this by a while. This is from the same 94-95 run. But also, its defeat is being eaten by Gamera. Not an exciting battle. It's pretty brief, but have you seen Gamera eat another kaiju before? These 94-95 rogues seem interchangeable to me, except for the design, so I'm judging based on the designs. But Gebarus gets this high because he got eaten by Gamera. What more do you want me to say? Okay, 18. Daimajin. As I mentioned in the blog post, Daimajin is a substantial Dai character who had a trilogy in the Showa era, and also some sparse appearances since. So in that blog post, I made the argument that in the big five of the Godzilla series, you still should count a son of character and King Kong, because King Kong technically meets the qualifications for having a film in each of the eras of Godzilla and being a notable monster with a lot of marquee value to him. Daimajin is the analog to that. If we're designing a big five, he's not part of it, but he exists alongside it. His films are often about feudal regime change more than battling kaiju, so while it'd be very cool to have him in his stone humanoid demon aesthetic fighting Gamera, he's not prone to it the same way King Kong was, but even King Kong had to be engorged, or however you want to say it, to fight, multiplied in size, I guess to say, to fight Godzilla. That said, a version of him called, I think, Bushin does appear in a great yokai movie. Daimajin, not King Kong. So there is some upward mobility, and really, you can make it work if you wanted to fight Gamera. Okay, 17. Maruko Bukarappa. Maruko Bukarappa. This is the original. So we've already seen a few of the beasts inspired by this thing, but I assure you this is the original overly long name ending in Rappa, broccoli-headed beast. Also part of why it's higher than those. This thing is a crazy and unique design. Just look at it. Soak it in. But not only, according to Wikizilla, not only does this thing exist without context in the Gamera vs. Gara Sharp 91 short, but it technically is also a previous concept for the antagonist of Gamera vs. Virus. Again, Virus is the connecting thread for all of this stuff. That makes this creature the Bacon of the Gamera franchise, as Bacon is notable in the Godzilla series for being constantly planned to appear over the course of a decade, but never actually making a canonical film appearance. He got in a video game, and this M creature, an official Laserdisc short. It is the Bacon of the series. It deserves this spot. No. And now for number 16. W. A two-headed dragon becoming Gamera's archenemy would be a derivative and forced Ghidorah pastiche, but the finer details that technically exist around this character make it quite compelling. In one version of... In the book Be Strong Gamera that I don't have access to, and I don't even know how to prove it exists, the concept is that the Virians and Zigrans, following their defeats, would create W on Terra from Gamera vs. Giron. So this connects multiple Gamera movies and Gamera villains into one thing. I imagine if it's made on Terra, it would bear their design features, like the silver and gray, a little bit of green aesthetic in there that Space Gauss had. Also, I've heard, though I haven't seen this in a while, so it might have been erroneously reported and then taken down off of wikis, that in this appearance, Bargon, Gauss, and the Whale God would team up with Gamera to fight this thing. Like, all we have of what this was actually planned for in the 1972 film was Gamera fighting W inside of flames. And that would have been cool and inventive because of how Noriaki Yuasa's mind worked in the direction and the special effects direction. And yeah, this guy is what inspired Wlius from before. The names are more similar in Japanese, but W is, I guess, short for Wyvern, which is a type of dragon that he would be inspired by. But W and Doubleless, you can kind of hear it in English as well. All right, the top 15 Gamera Kaiju. These are more serious Kaiju that I can say a lot more about. I still do want to keep it kind of brief, though. I don't think anyone else has had this order for the Kaiju so far, but maybe I'm not the only one that thinks this way. Leave your rankings in the comments below. Number 15. Xanon. So, why am I starting off the section that actually counts the top 15 Gamera Kaiju with something, not a Kaiju, a Star Destroyer from Star Wars? They kind of just like plagiarized that. Anyway, two reasons. It has the capacity to send out Gamera's previous foes through stock footage battles, and Gamera has to sacrifice himself to destroy it. Gamera's reputation is not exactly for dying, just coming close to it. So close it's hard to tell until the humans have helped him to get a second wind. Xanon is notable for acquiring the death of Gamera in the draft, put to film at least. Gamera was initially supposed to have survived, and if he had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's a subjective list, so I can do whatever I want. The design, I mean, it's still pretty iconic. Star Destroyers really caught on. That's why this thing aped it. But I want to build a progressing argument here. Xanon is important and works in context. You can get to the Xanon concept in better ways, though, and I'll tell you more about what I mean later on. Number 14 is manga. Manga filled the role of Space Gyaos in previous versions of Gamera vs. Giron, being the creation of the Terrans that destroys them that Giron butchers. As far as I know, nothing else would change from their inclusion. Okay, for one thing, a mammal kaiju would be unique, but look at this design. Think about how weird and psychedelic seeing a flying knife vivisecting this thing would be. I don't prefer this thing to Space Gyaos, but it deserves its chance in the limelight under Giron's blade or fighting Gamera. Because both could have happened if you have the suit. Technically, if it truly replaces Space Gyaos, it would also be a horde monster and could suffer multiple glorious deaths. 13. Powered Gyaos. This is from that 94-95 comic, but this is an interesting Zenin-type scenario. It's a combination of all of Gamera's canonical Showa-era opponents. Barugon, Gyaos, Virus, Giron, Jiger, and Zigra. It's a step up from Zenin, just sending these foes out in stock footage, but it feels more like something out of Power Rangers than out of Gamera. This is a nitpick, but was this truly the best mixture of design elements that was possible? It doesn't truly feel like Gamera's facing all these threats again, or even the most dangerous parts of them. Just something representing all of them. Still, I appreciate this for what it was at the time. A way to group the Showa-era kaiju as more important than those lesser original kaiju. But we still can do better, and we'll get there. Just hot take time. Zigra is 12 here. Zigra the Goblin Shark is a more complicated one to rank, as technically he is a sort of retread of Virus that is more streamlined. As a inspired alien invader, he has a better showing of the ability of speech, and he also has one hench person instead of multiple that just sort of all blend in the background. His hench person has characterization. The movie was not able to live up to the premise in either case, but Zigra fares better. Zigra has appeared in a lesser role in some comics, and when time came for Gamera Rebirth, Zigra became essentially a seafaring Gyaos to have an underwater dogfight with Gamera and make only one grunt that references his previous capacity for speech. So one of the least respected monsters in the show. That's part of why he's here, but still a really cool fight. Why he's this high? Until such time he's done better in a season 2 or a movie, he'll stay at this spot. I like him, but he's probably my least favorite of the Gamera kaiju from the movies. 11. Barugon. I really like all the monsters up from here. And I like both versions of Zigra. It's just... Though we have discussed monsters based on monsters that did not appear in a film, Barugon has had the least fair run, even including those, because his suit was the most rudimentary of the Showa suits, so it looks terrible in the fight. The movie has good human-on-human fights, though, so Lizard Brain can still be engaged. And Dai and Kadokawa passed him up for reinvention in the Heisei series, Gamera the Brave, and Gamera Rebirth. After considering him for each of those, he still got the film and whatever comic appearances fate would grant, but he lost out on an iconic run he could have had if his trajectory followed that of Anguirus, first opponent to Godzilla, or even Ghidorah, first greater of two evils compared to Godzilla. Barugon done as a mid-level boss in Gamera Rebirth Season 2, if such a thing will ever exist, would raise his placement potentially a couple spots, because the chameleon-type look with the iconic tongue and rainbow death ray would look so much cooler in the 21st century than it did in the 20th. I have two pictures here, one of him firing that rainbow death ray that he has. He also has freeze breath from his tongue. Picture above it is from the Heisei manga that's technically in continuity with the Heisei films, reinterpreted as a more threatening-looking monster. Number 10, Morphos. Morphos, from a comic, is actually a pretty well-fleshed-out monster for just one appearance. Hence ranking in the top 10, Gamera does not have a doppelganger or opponent like Mechagodzilla or Space Godzilla to Godzilla or Mechanic Kong or Scar King to King Kong. But Morphos here is a thing of shape-shifting metal that can morph into Gamera, framing him for damage, but also being materially a very difficult foe to beat. It's made of metal. Originally envisioned as an alternate hero to humanity, he is ultimately unreliable in that regard, similar to Iris in the third Heisei film, but this is a mirror match package, because he fights him as Gamera. Of all these concepts so far, I would most like to see Morphos appear in a film. Also, I should mention, apparently a Game Boy game had a disconnected fake Gamera. So we are covered in that regard technically and not including it here. But this is more interesting than a straight fake Gamera would be, because it's not just Gamera. Morphos can turn into anything in theory. So this is just a more organic route to the powered Gauss concept. But also, because this thing is metal, it's a metal thing that replicates Gamera's previously, it can do Xanon better than Xanon did. A way of innovation on previous concepts. Trust me, Kadokawa, bringing Morphos as the final foe of a new season of Rebirth, it can work. Jiger is very cool. A demon Triceratops, magnetism, flight, a death ray, and nose projectile darts that go into each of Gamera's arms, preventing him from tucking them in, functionally crucifying him in such a way that only can happen to a turtle. What more can you ask for? Well, she also impregnates Gamera with her demon spawn that two little boys have to abort after going into Gamera's body. There's a level of absurdity here that does not feel like jumping the shark because of Yuasa and Takahashi's storytelling style. The first thing she does after waking up from being sealed away is take a big long drink of water, because even though she has way more abilities than I can keep track of, she cycles through her moveset. Not arbitrarily. She still is a creature, albeit a cartoon one. The filmmakers keep track of her abilities in the fights with Gamera. She stops using them because he learns how to counter them individually. On her own, she might be one of the weakest monsters, but with all the special abilities, she takes 3 rounds for Gamera to beat. She came back for Rebirth, where she was literally and also metaphorically spayed. So no kids and no abilities. Also took away the Emperor storyline. The design is still cool, and it works in contrast to the other Kaiju in that show, but as a game of averages, Rebirth Jiger holds the original one down from being placed higher on the list. Actually, while we're talking about Rebirth Jiger, she seems to be equal parts inspired by Jiger and Horde Beast Nezera, the scrapped predecessor to Gamera that there's a documentary about the making and scrapping of. All of you Nezera fans, I'm sorry, but the rat is not on this list. I would have added it, but I got to the nice and even number of 30 without it, so... Anyway, also, more importantly, unlike the crazier designs of Hari Nezera, I mean, this is just a rat. And I can't judge the execution the same way. The scenes of the rat-like Jiger babies feasting in the sewer in Rebirth are very good. In Rebirth, she doesn't have one child, but there are a bunch of baby Jigers that hatch, so they all eat each other until one big one forms. Equal parts, just survival of the fittest, but also a Rat King kind of scenario. Anyway, those are very good scenes. And the design of Rebirth Jiger in the limbs looks more rat-like. This is a bad picture, but when she's rolled over on her back, you can kind of see it better. Lends up well to the fight. It's good. Okay, Garasharp. Garasharp is often conflated for W, the dual-headed snake I mentioned earlier. But Garasharp himself has origins in 1991 as part of a Laserdisc set or something. Ultimately still designed by Yuasa and Takahashi, and the others just not canon in the same way a film would have been. The short shows off a pretty classic Gamera stock plot against Garasharp, with them falling victim to the gimmick, and then defeating the monster ultimately. But Gamera, after defeating Garasharp, ends up relocating its young to an island, so the self-defense force will not hurt them. The only time Gamera being the friend to all children, and not just human children, has ever been addressed. Then there were comic appearances for Garasharp with electric powers and Garen Sharp that I already talked about, and that is all cool, but Matt Frank's semi-canon Heisei Trilogy prequel comic, The Last Hope, is the main reason for being this high. In the Heisei series, they recontextualized Gamera as being made by Atlanteans, something talked about as possible in the Showa series, but not dwelled upon. In the Heisei series, Gyaos was menacing the Atlanteans, like Space Gyaos the Terrans, after they created that, so they create Gamera to defeat Gyaos. And in this comic, they created the Gyaos to get rid of their problem with Garasharp. Look at that design. It's pretty cool. Garasharp's remained in public consciousness the longest of all these scrapped monsters, so he deserves a shot. And hey, if that doesn't work, there's no reason. You can't bring back Garen Sharp. Or make a new not Garen Sharp and call it Garber Sharp or something. There's no excuse not to use a snake monster like this. If your monster cast exceeds like 10, because he's there, there's like... Yeah, it is what it is. He's cool. Virus. As I talked about in the blog post, of all the non-Gauss villains for Gamera, Virus has the next best claim to fame. As through the multimedia history of Gamera, Virus has been perhaps the most consistent major villain, also the tie to many other villains, in a weird way. Gamera Rebirth also set him apart from the other returning monsters by having multiple episodes of build-up. In any case, Virus as a squid or octopus has one of the coolest designs, whether he's skinny and pale blue, or a sickly Ghidorah-inspired gold. Gyaos. Those of you that are outward fans of Gamera probably guessed when this list was 30 monsters that I was differentiating Showa Gyaos, Heisei Gyaos, Super Gyaos, Hyper Gyaos, Albino Gyaos, Original Gyaos, Rebirth Gyaos, and S Gyaos into separate categories. Well, I'm not. Sorry to say. This is Composite Gyaos, the bird with a sonic scalpel that will always oppose Gamera. Showa Gyaos was a fine monster, but the Heisei series really redefined him and tied him into Gamera's backstory in such an important way. They're inextricable from each other. Though Virus, Garen Sharp, or Morphos would make excellent arch rivals, Gyaos is locked into that role now. I think Gamera Rebirth has the best versions of Gyaos. For balancing a horde terrorizing a city with larger specimens for Gamera to fight one-on-one, the most obligatory use of Gyaos is probably in Gamera the Brave. Though that movie's otherwise almost perfect, Gyaos always comes back. And so far, it is always impactful for one reason or the other when it does. Gamera, again, composite. This case, it hurts the placement for some while helping them for others. Noriaki Yuasa's vision of Gamera resonates with me a lot for the sincerity of it. But the studio meddling makes the character arc not really work unless you ignore the second movie or the first and second and use some mental gymnastics. The Heisei Gamera has the opposite problem, where it is a plot thread followed through near perfectly, but on a shakier foundation where the studio meddling helped. Kaneko and Ito wanted Gamera to be an edgier beast with the darker design elements that grow throughout the trilogy from the get-go and less of an organic kaiju. They wanted to play up the unknowable mechanical side of Gamera, which makes it harder to empathize with people. Kaneko's criticisms of Gamera the Brave really don't make sense to me, especially in the movies he made, but that can be a separate video in and of itself. Toto from Gamera the Brave is a brilliant incarnation, but one of the ugliest designs, and he lacks the traditional roar, which is going to hold him back a little bit. Rebirth is great for the limited moments he gets per episode, but he's a bit too strong, a bit too armored, to realistically get knocked out as much as he does in the show, and bleed as much as he does in the show. Every main version of Gamera excels in something and has a different weakness. You can't have Gamera without Gamera, though Code Thyrsus, from what I've heard, comes pretty close to that. Alright, Zedus, the main villain of Gamera the Brave. I've talked about Zedus before in the review on this channel for Gamera the Brave. I like him. One of my favorite monsters, number 4 on this list. Should he be this high? Probably not. He's just a quadrupedal little dinosaur with a frill and a big tongue, inspired by Bargon, but bipedal again this time. Pretty sadistic. Some people claim he's being controlled by the ghosts of the Gyaos, but my thing is he shouldn't have been able to even eat the Gyaos to mutate, because the opening with the Gyaos takes place 30 years before the rest of the film. What's he been doing for 30 years? Weakest part of the movie, otherwise near perfect movie. Anyway, I like him. He's a starter villain that comes off as such an imposing threat for the baby Gamera, or the baby into young adult Gamera that Toto is in the movie. You have that personal rivalry, while also balancing pretty high stakes for what it was. In any case, you can hear more of my thoughts in that review. Top 3, Legion. Legion probably is the best monster in the entire series, because Legion is this extraterrestrial menace. But unlike the other films, where there's still creativity, but a very childlike creativity, this is where Kaneko and Ito and their team excelled in the monster design. Legion functions like an invading army in the movie, with the Legion soldiers, the Legion pod plants, nuking Sendai, and the Mother Legion controlling them. But these are truly alien designs. Human size with one eye in the center and the limbs. Very hard. They go after silicone. They consume silicone, I mean. And they have pneumatics to move their bodies around. Sort of a hive mind collective to them. The plan is that the pod from the alien Legion plant shoots around the universe, spreading the thing. They're called Legion because someone references the Bible in the movie. The Legion that, fights Jesus. That's an oversimplification of that. And it fits into the larger thematic stuff. Gamera is basically Jesus in this movie. He doesn't get crucified, but he does the death and rebirth thing, and there's praying to him. It also brings in the the Eastern concept of mana, though mana is also a Western thing through Christianity, through Judaism, so yeah. I like Legion. Not as much as I like the next one. So this one is just pure subjective preference. Space Gauss. This is technically cheating, since I grouped in every other kind of Gauss. But I really love this look for Gauss. And the choreography of how Giron absolutely destroys it. In this shot, the leg is off, but he also loses the head, the arms. Gets cut into fillets. It is hilarious. This version of Gauss also deserves credit for doing the Heisei Gauss backstory before Heisei Gauss. Because Space Gauss is a created race by the Terrans that destroys them, necessitating their own tusked trifibian monster to hunt them down. In that case, Giron, not Gamera. Just a very easy pick for me, even though there's far less substance here than with Legion. So, who's left as the number one spot? Giron. Where do I start with Giron? He's a knife that in previous concepts was a fish. So he's a quadrupedal fish. And can swim, he can walk on land, more like crawl. He can fly, or at least jump so well. He's practically flying. He can fly, he can jump as well as a Gamera can fly, I mean to say. He's trifibian, he has the tusks, he's a shadow Gamera in those ways, because he also has a connection to the two remaining Terrans, as Gamera had a connection to the two Earthlings that went with him to Terra. They're both protectors of their planet and enemies of Gauss. Their battle eventually devolves into an acrobatic gymnastics show. What more to love about that? Akira Inoue said it best, only Giron is like this. And Gamera Rebirth understood these core attributes. I saw so many people redesigning Giron in their fan art as being a tanky thing. But in Gamera Rebirth, he's a slinky, essentially, with a knife on the end of it. Even more acrobatic. Giron has the best fight against Gamera in the entire show. That's not even up for debate. The least screen time, but the most impactful thing. Giron's amazing, man. Alright, I hope my list was not too controversial. Part of the fun of enjoying cult films is the conversations and often disagreements you can have with the community talking about them. This list is probably not the same for anybody else, and that is okay. There's a Gamera monster for everybody, and to prove that point, I had to dig into some rather deep into some comics you may not have heard about. For the sake of brevity, I breezed past some of the tie-ins that did not feature new monsters, but still did advance the careers of these staple kaiju. And all of this has made me more interested in learning more about them, and the tertiary material of the franchise, to where I'm considering buying a translation, or if easier in the original Japanese, though that's hard as well. I'm currently in a 1010 Japanese class, and hope to be able to apply what I'm learning to some of these secondary and tertiary canon texts, if I can get my hands on them. I don't expect to be able to read above a young child level in Japanese. I just don't expect most of these manga to be written above a young child's reading level. I can't make any promises about that, though. Still, this exercise revealed a great variety of Gamera kaiju that have never appeared alongside him in a feature film for whatever reason. And though wherever the franchise goes should look forward, it should remember its roots, and at least a few of these other forgotten kaiju. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can like and subscribe or follow us on Facebook or our blog. We also have a TikTok page. That's a wrap.